Executive session. Let me begin by welcoming back Senator Moran, who is still to arrive, but I'm sure he will, and to welcome Senator Jones to the committee. Both Senator Moran and Senator Jones will provide great perspectives and a depth of knowledge to the committee, and I look forward to working with them as we address the critical issues before us. Today, the committee will vote on the nominations of individuals who were voted out of committee last year, but whose nominations were not carried over into this session of Congress. We will proceed to the vote on the nominations of the Honorable Jerome Powell of Maryland to be Chairman of the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System, the Honorable Randall Quarles of Colorado to be a member of the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System, the Honorable Brian Montgomery of Texas to be the HUD Assistant Secretary for Housing and Federal Housing Commissioner, and Mr. Robert Hunter Kurtz of Virginia to be Assistant Secretary for Public and Indian Housing, and Mr. David Ryder of New Jersey to be the Director of the U.S. Mint. I encourage all of my colleagues to vote yes on each of these nominations. In the interest of time, Senator Brown and I have agreed to forego opening statements on these nominees since we have spoken on them before, and any other member wishing to make a statement may do so at the conclusion of our votes. Senator Brown, do you have...
Yeah, only very briefly, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, and I welcome Senator Moran back to our committee. He was what I guess on your side you call temporary member for some time and contributed a lot to this committee. We're glad he's back on and appreciate his even-handed look at these issues. And Senator Doug Jones from Alabama, we welcome him. He, like me, has a regional bank presence in his state. In my state, we have Key and Fifth Third and Huntington. In his state, he has Regions Bank, headquartered in Birmingham. And his interests, I know he's particularly interested in housing issues, and this committee has not advanced housing issues as much as a lot of us would like. I know with Chairman Crapo, there's a good deal more interest in it now than there was maybe the last 2 or 3 or 4 years, and I'm appreciative of that and welcome Doug Jones to the committee. Since our prior statements and votes have established a recent record on the nominees for whom we will vote for or against today, I will simply not take time to reiterate those views and want to proceed. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Senator Brown. And we will now move for individual votes on the Powell, Quarles, Montgomery, Kurtz, and Ryder nominations. I understand we are in agreement to do voice votes on each of them. I now move then to report favorably the nomination of the Honorable Jerome Powell to be Chairman of the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System. All in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, nay? Nay. Do you want to be recorded, Senator Warren? Senator Warren will be recorded as no. The ayes have it, and the nomination is hereby ordered reported favorably to the full Senate. I now move to report favorably the nomination of Honorable Randall Quarles to be a member of the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System for a term of 14 years from February 1, 2018. All in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, no? Do any of those who voted no wish to be recorded? Senator Warren, Senator Cortez Masto will be recorded as voting no. Senator Reed will be recorded as voting no. The ayes do have it, and the nomination is hereby ordered reported favorably to the full Senate. I now move to report favorably the nomination of the Honorable Brian Montgomery to be Assistant Secretary for Housing, Federal Housing Commissioner, U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. All in favor say aye. 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 Opposed, no? No. Do any wish to be recorded? No. Senator Warren and Senator Reed. And Senator Cortez Masto, sorry. The ayes do have it. The nomination is hereby ordered reported favorably to the full Senate. I now move to report favorably the nomination of Mr. Robert Hunter Kurtz to be Assistant Secretary for Public and Indian Housing, U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. All in favor say aye. 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 Opposed, no? No. Senator Warren will be noted as voting no. The ayes have it. The nomination is hereby ordered reported favorably to the full Senate. I now move to report favorably the nomination of Mr. David Ryder to be the Director of the U.S. Mint. All those in favor say aye. 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 Opposed, no? There are no nays. The nomination has been approved and will be hereby ordered reported favorably to the full Senate. Are there any senators who wish to make a statement at this time before we move to the hearing? Seeing none, the executive session is now concluded, and we will move to open session for a hearing on combating money laundering and other forms of illicit finance. The hearing will come to order. This morning, the committee will receive testimony from Treasury and Justice Department witnesses on the potential for modernization of the United States anti-money laundering and counter-terrorist financing regime. We look forward to hearing the government's views on strengthening enforcement and protecting the integrity of the U.S. financial system in a new technological era. The committee held a hearing with industry stakeholders on this same topic last week. A clear bipartisan interest in modernizing the BSA-AML regime emerged from that hearing. The hearing highlighted significant interest in several areas.
To the next when we do an executive.
Excuse me, in several areas: beneficial ownership, information sharing, technology, and BSA reporting requirements. The hearing also highlighted the need to work with bank examiners to ensure that AML compliance is not just a check-the-box exercise. There seems to be space to improve information and coordination between industry, regulators, and law enforcement. The breadth of each of these areas merit further consideration and discussion. For example, today's technology promises new ways to catch criminals and facilitate compliance. But technology also poses challenges for law enforcement, such as the rise of cryptocurrencies and their potential to facilitate sanctions evasion and perhaps other crimes. I appreciate the strong interest in this topic from my Banking Committee colleagues and others in the Senate. As this committee looks deeper into the potential for reforms or modernization of the broader U.S. counter-threat financing space, all stakeholder interests must be critically examined to assure that financial institutions, among a myriad of other stakeholders, can work effectively with the government to efficiently provide information that results in a high degree of usefulness to combat crime and terrorism. The committee, in doing its work on this shared policy goal, must also be ever mindful of the potential for creating any new or different set of unintended consequences that may lead to inefficiencies and undue burdens. Clearly, the United States cannot afford to allow criminals and terrorists to move illicit funds in furtherance of their criminal objectives. At the same time, during last week's hearing, Mr. Baer shared an example of a community banker with a $100 million bank and 3 branches. This bank had 7 AML compliance officers and only 4 lending officers. We cannot let AML compliance weigh disproportionately on the costs of community banks. I look forward to working with my colleagues and helping to find a bipartisan path forward to a modernized, reformed BSA-AML regime that works for law enforcement, industry, and other stakeholders. Undersecretary Mandelker and Mr. Day, I'm eager to hear your thoughts today. Your testimony will help set the stage for taking BSA-AML compliance and enforcement into the future. Senator Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And we both welcome Senator Moran to the committee. Welcome. Jerry, nice to see you. And the Chairman appropriately introduced you earlier. So.
Patience.
Thanks for calling this important hearing as a follow-up to our session last week as we begin to consider ideas to strengthen and reform our money laundering and illicit finance laws. I'm pleased today we'll hear administration views, including from Treasury Undersecretary for Terrorism and Financial Intelligence, Mandelker, welcome, and Deputy Assistant Attorney General Day from the Criminal Division, welcome. They will both, I'm sure, provide important law enforcement and counterterrorism perspectives. As I noted last week, we should keep in mind that we're operating against a backdrop where in recent years, some of the world's largest banks and their foreign partners continue to run afoul of these laws. In some cases, they had inadequate anti-money laundering oversight and compliance regimes. In others, banks willfully and persistently violated U.S. bank secrecy, sanctions, and anti-corruption laws. Though some have tried to minimize them, these were not simply paperwork missteps or administrative errors. In fact, the GAO concluded last year that over recent 6 years, approximately $12 billion was collected in fines and penalties and forfeitures from financial institutions for violations of the Bank Secrecy Act, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, and the U.S. sanctions requirements, including $5 billion specifically assessed for Bank Secrecy Act violations. Some of these banks violated U.S. anti-money laundering and sanctions laws by knowingly facilitating illegal financial transactions for rogue regimes in Iran and Sudan and Libya and Syria and Burma, and in some cases for trying to conceal this activity by repeatedly stripping relevant information from transaction records. Some conducted transactions with individuals or entities affiliated with terrorist organizations and drug cartels directly in violation of U.S. law. Many violated the law for several years. I encourage my colleague to read a sampling of these deferred prosecution agreements on these banks. Some will make your hair stand on end. These are not victimless crimes. In addition to strengthening, for example, interdiction of the supply of drugs like fentanyl coming into the country through initiatives like My Interdict Act signed into law by the president last week, we also must cut off traffickers' money supply. Money laundering on behalf of drug cartels has a direct line to the opioid epidemic in my state, where Sinaloa cartel actors have been active, destroying thousands of families. 11 people a day, more than any other state, die in my state every single day. 11 people die. Human traffickers exploiting the misery of runaways here, recruiting young women from overseas with promises of legitimate work in the U.S., use our financial system to launder their profits. That's why these laws are so critical. They protect the integrity of our financial system. They provide critical intelligence to law enforcement to combat crime. Even so, as last week's hearing made clear, we want to assess whether there are ways to responsibly update and strengthen the current anti-money laundering framework, including through new measures to require beneficial ownership information when companies are formed in the U.S., shedding once and for all the U.S. reputation for being a haven for anonymous shell companies. That must end. Broadening information sharing may make sense, but there are good reasons that such sharing was limited to terrorism and money laundering cases after 9/11. Important questions about privacy protections must be answered before considering any expansion. As we heard from witnesses last week, we should focus on sharpening suspicious activity reporting and bolstering efforts by law enforcement to give banks better guidance on what to look for instead of on substantially raising currency reporting thresholds. Questions have been raised, including on how to enable banks to make better use of artificial intelligence while retaining room for critical human judgments. I know today's two distinguished government witnesses have thought deeply for years about these issues. We welcome you both and look forward to hearing your perspectives. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Brown. First, we will receive testimony from the Honorable Sigal Mandelker, who is the Undersecretary for Terrorism and Financial Crimes at the U.S. Department of Treasury. And following her, we will hear from Mr. Kendall Day, who is the Acting Deputy Assistant Attorney General for the Criminal Division of the U.S. Department of Justice. Undersecretary Mandelker, you may please proceed. I do remind the witnesses to try to follow the 5-minute clock that you have in front of you so we have time for questions, and to remind our senators to follow your own 5-minute clocks when it's time for your questions. Please proceed.
Thank you, Chairman Crapo, Ranking Member Brown, and distinguished members of the committee. As the Undersecretary for Treasury's Office of Terrorism and Financial Intelligence, I'm honored to once again appear before you today to discuss the critical work that we at TFI are doing to safeguard the United States and international financial system. The offices that I lead are tasked, as you know, with using our financial intelligence, expertise, and powerful economic authorities to combat terrorist financing, money laundering, weapons proliferators, rogue regimes, human rights abusers, cyber criminals, and other illicit finance and national security threats to the United States and in the international financial system to our allies. TFI is actually the only office in the world that houses these unique authorities under one roof. And we are proactively integrating our authorities and expertise across components, deploying the best tools suited to each challenge and achieving significant impact. The foundation of our economic authorities is a strong and robust anti-money laundering, combating the financing of terrorism regime. And one of my top priorities as Undersecretary is to ensure that the AML-CFT framework remains strong and effective. Such a regime keeps illicit actors out of the financial system and allows us to track and target those who try to slip through. And that is exactly what we have been doing against a wide array of law enforcement and national security priorities. Just as an example, we've been laser focused on using our unique economic tools to identify and disrupt North Korea's use of covert representatives, as well as front and trade companies to disguise, move, and launder funds that finance its weapons programs. We are also targeting Iran's use of deceptive financial practices to generate revenue. As just one example, in November, we sanctioned an IRGC Quds Force network involved in a large-scale scheme to counterfeit banknotes to support its destabilizing activities. In the past year, we have imposed sanctions, issued financial advisories, and undertaken diplomatic engagements to counter human rights abusers and the corrupt across the globe. Just last month, we sanctioned human rights abusers and corrupt actors under an executive order that builds on the Global Magnitsky Act, which was passed by Congress just over 1 year ago. We are also using our other economic tools and authorities, such as using geographic targeting orders and exercising other authorities against transnational criminal organizations, cyber criminals, human trafficking networks, and other law enforcement priorities. And we are taking a hard look, as you are, at the Bank Secrecy Act and the broader AML-CFT regime. We need to continuously upgrade and modernize our system, which was a statutory and regulatory construct that was originally adopted in the 1970s, and make sure that we have the right framework in place to take us into the 2030s and beyond. In particular, we have to make sure that financial institutions are devoting their resources towards high-value activities and are encouraged to innovate with new technologies and approaches so that we and law enforcement are able to better address these threats. And we're working closely with our law enforcement and regulatory partners in this effort. In recent years, financial institutions have been more proactive in their AML-CFT efforts, building sophisticated internal financial intelligence units, improving their ability to identify customers and monitor transactions by experimenting with new technologies, and working together to share information. We think these are good developments. These initiatives advance the BSA's underlying purpose and have been instrumental in assisting our efforts to identify and disrupt key streams of financing by illicit actors, including, just as an example, North Korea. We've also been working with the financial community to understand their perspectives and achieve our shared objectives. They're on the front lines, detecting and blocking illicit financing streams, combating financial crimes, and managing risk. Deploying our tools for maximum impact also requires proactive dialogue and information sharing with financial institutions. Enhancing public-private partnerships that reveal and mitigate vulnerabilities is a top priority of ours. That is why last month we launched FinCEN Exchange, a new public-private information sharing program led by FinCEN. FinCEN Exchange is bringing law enforcement, financial institutions, and FinCEN together to facilitate greater information sharing between the public and private sectors on issues like cases, typologies, and threats. This effort enables the private sector to better identify risks and provides FinCEN and law enforcement with critical information to disrupt money laundering and other financial crimes. I want to thank the committee for its leadership and support, both of which are truly essential to combating the threats that we face and ensuring our continued success. I look forward to working with this committee on AML, CFT improvements, and with other members of Congress as we seek to fulfill our shared responsibilities to keep Americans safe and secure.
Thank you. Mr. Day.
Thank you, Senator. Chairman Crapo, Ranking Member Brown, and members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to discuss our nation's anti-money laundering laws, including the Bank Secrecy Act. The Department of Justice draws upon the resources and expertise of various components to combat money laundering, including the Criminal Division's Money Laundering and Asset Recovery Section, the U.S. Attorney's Offices, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the Drug Enforcement Administration, and other prosecution and investigating components and agencies. We work with partners across the country and around the globe to pursue complex, sensitive, multi-district, and international money laundering, and asset recovery investigations and cases. We devote significant resources to this problem because money laundering facilitates some of the most serious and significant threats to our security and our safety. Transnational criminal organizations, kleptocrats, cybercriminal groups, terrorists, drug cartels, and alien smugglers alike must find ways to disguise and use their illicit proceeds. Money laundering, which best estimates peg at more than $2 trillion annually, is a global problem, but the threat it poses to the United States is acute and specific. Here we enjoy some of the deepest, most liquid, and most stable markets in the world. Those features of the U.S. financial system attract legitimate trade and investment, foster economic development, and promote confidence in our markets and in our government. Those advantages, transparency, liquidity, and stability, also attract criminals. Through vigorous anti-money laundering enforcement, we protect those hallmarks of our financial system, and we safeguard our citizens from the harms wrought by the underlying criminal conduct. Unfortunately, however, criminals frequently seek to thwart or evade our efforts by exploiting gaps and vulnerabilities in the existing laws and regulations. As you are aware, the pervasive use of front companies, shell companies, nominees, and other means to conceal the beneficial owners of assets is one of the great loopholes in this country's anti-money laundering regime. We constantly see bad actors using these entities to disguise the ownership of the dirty money they derive from their criminal activities. The Bank Secrecy Act imposes a range of obligations on financial institutions, including reporting suspicious activity, performing customer due diligence, preventing transactions that involve the proceeds of criminal activity, and establishing effective anti-money laundering programs. These requirements play a critical role in the law enforcement's fight against money laundering. Effectively, they mean that financial institutions are often the front line of our nation's efforts to prevent and detect such activity. Ensuring the ability of financial institutions to detect, investigate, and report illicit financial activity is of critical importance to law enforcement and the U.S. government's fight to combat money laundering and prevent terrorist financing. Compliance with the Bank Secrecy Act is fundamental to protecting the security of financial institutions and the integrity of the financial system as a whole. In most cases, financial institutions seek to do the right thing, implementing effective anti-money laundering programs to detect and prevent money laundering through the U.S. financial system. In some cases, however, financial institutions have willfully failed to implement effective anti-money laundering programs or failed to document suspicious transactions. In recent years, the Department of Justice has resolved numerous anti-money laundering and sanctions-based violations with major financial institutions, demonstrating that those institutions still struggle to create and incentivize anti-money laundering and sanctions compliance programs. The effectiveness of our current anti-money laundering regime merits continued discussion among law enforcement, industry, and Congress as we strive to detect, target, and disrupt illicit financial networks that threaten our country. I am pleased to be with you talking about these important issues, and I thank the committee for holding this hearing today to bring attention to the threat that money laundering poses to our financial system and our national security. I'll be pleased to take the committee's questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you to both of you. And my first question is just to ask each of you to, very briefly, if you could, tell me if there are reforms to our system that are gaining attention in your offices, of things in your office or in your work that you and your colleagues believe need to be fixed or changed. Ms. Mandelker?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So what I can tell you is, look, there are reforms and then there are actions that we can take independent of any legislative reforms, such as
yes. And I'm referring to legislative fixes.
Understood. So I do think that this is a very important time to take a look at the BSA framework that was stood up again in the 1970s. We have to look to see whether or not our reporting requirements are sufficiently meeting our needs. We have to look to make sure that we have a system in place that is harnessing all those financial crimes analysts that are sitting in the financial institutions and are very much on the front lines of what we're trying to accomplish through there. through their reporting. So we're taking a very hard look at that framework. We're looking at the thresholds. We're looking at the examination process. I think it's very important to study these issues carefully, to engage in conversations with law enforcement about what's been useful to them, what's been most useful, what hasn't been as useful, so that we're getting the information that we need from the financial institutions in the right way, in the right form. And also so that we're incentivizing the financial institutions to prioritize work that's of high value to us. I know that there's a lot of discussion, just as an example, about the examination process. So we need to take a look at the examination process and make sure, again, that it's tailored towards incentivizing the banks to do the difficult work of analyzing potential illicit activity in the way that's going to be most productive
Rather
for
than
us.
checking the box.
That's right.
Thank you. Mr. Day?
Thank you, Chairman. I think in addition to the issues that Undersecretary Mandelker mentioned, I'd like to flag beneficial ownership. That is an issue that continues to present challenges for law enforcement because it's no secret that one of the ways criminals try to obscure their conduct is by hiding behind shell companies and front companies. Law enforcement has to devote enormous resources and time to piercing the corporate veil and amassing the evidence necessary to figure out who stands behind these companies and who is actually benefiting from the illicit financial flows. So that is another area that I think is ripe for consideration legislatively.
Well, thank you. And I appreciated the written testimony you both provided, and we will look forward to further information from you on helping to achieve these objectives as we move forward with legislative efforts here. And back to something that you've both referenced, there was a lot of discussion in our last hearing about this check-the-box notion, that we have an army of analysts out there, but the question that seemed to come through to me in the last hearing, or one of them was, are they just mathematically looking at numbers and checking boxes as they report transactions, or are they trying to analytically identify what is risky or dangerous behavior and help you find that? Could you both address you see the objective that we want to get and the objective we want to avoid? Could you address that for me?
So I want to just start by saying that we have a cadre of examiners that we work with that are in the federal banking agencies that are, of course, very devoted and dedicated to make sure that financial institutions are complying with their AML CFT obligations. At the same time, I think that now is a very good opportunity to have a discussion with the federal banking agencies that are conducting these exams to make sure that they're understanding what our priorities are from the Treasury Department, from law enforcement, to make sure that we are incentivizing financial institutions in the right way to devote their very substantial resources towards the high value threats, towards identifying AML, CFT risks. And so I have begun that process. We're discussing this very issue with the federal banking agencies, and you will be hearing more from us on that front. I think this is a very important time to have that conversation.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I will say that the information we get from the existing regime is very helpful to law enforcement. Our job fundamentally is all about identifying crimes, catching criminals, putting them in jail, and we often initiate investigations based on that reporting, as well as if we have a pre-existing investigation that started with other information, further an investigation with the intelligence we were able to glean from that reporting. So I think that is very true. There's opportunity to consider this issue. It's just, it should be done with an eye toward preserving what is already good about the system.
Thank you. Senator Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Mandelker, let me start with you. I'm sure you're familiar with the recent Clearinghouse Association report on these issues. One clearinghouse recommendation is to have FinCEN's BSA authority, oversight authority over large banks delegated to federal banking agencies over 20 years ago, returned to FinCEN. But it seems clear FinCEN doesn't have the bandwidth to make such a radical change. My questions are these connected to that. Do you know what this change would require in terms of additional federal funding and personnel? Why would we redo a system, an oversight system that's worked reasonably well and put in place the kind of centralized examination teams suggested by the clearinghouse when bank examiners already have extensive expertise and experience with these large entities on BSA issues and have been doing this job successfully for years. Tell us what you think.
So I can't tell you exactly what the numbers would look like if we were if we were to take back that authority. What I can tell you is that it's again very important as we are with our partners charged with safeguarding the financial system. It's very important that we have continued conversations with the federal banking agencies, with those examiners, so that they understand what law enforcement's priorities are, and so that we continue to have an active discussion about how they're executing those responsibilities. So that's where our focus is, and of course we also have responsibility to, not just with respect to banks, but we have other responsibilities when it comes to executing our oversight responsibilities with money service businesses in the virtual currency space, among a wide variety of areas. So we're very mindful of how we allocate our resources to make sure that we're not undertaking duplicative efforts.
Thank you. Mr. Day, as recently as last September, its quarterly report to the court on HSBC's deferred prosecution agreement, which stemmed from the bank's unlawful moving of hundreds of millions of dollars from Mexican drug cartels and other AML violations. DOJ wrote the following: "The Monitor has observed that HSBC is continuing to work towards the implementation of a reasonably effective and sustainable AML and sanctions compliance program," unquote. But despite progress in certain areas, the Monitor had still identified quote-unquote significant control deficiencies. It also noted that HSBC has successfully implemented the majority of the Monitor's recommendations, but has not implemented others. Even so, last month, DOJ agreed to terminate its deferred prosecution agreement with HSBC. As the Monitor certified with no conditions or qualifications that HSBC has complied with the letter and the spirit of its obligation to effectively implement a sound AML compliance program? That's the first question. And the second, if so, how do you reconcile that with recent statements by the Monitor that HSBC still has those control deficiencies I mentioned and has not implemented all the Monitor's recommendation? Why didn't DOJ simply extend the deferred prosecution, the term of the DPA, as is done with other DPAs in the past?
Thank you, Senator, for that question. I think it's important to highlight the department's the lens through which we view this type of conduct. Our role in this area is really to prosecute willful violations of the Bank Secrecy Act. So in other words, when a financial institution understands its obligations and persists in choosing another course of conduct they know doesn't satisfy the law. That was the reason behind the initial deferred prosecution that we brought in 2012. Since then, though, as we've reported to the court in regular filings, including the ones you've mentioned, the bank had not engaged in that type of misconduct. Rather, they had gone about a very lengthy process of taking the Monitor's recommendations and implementing them. That's the lens that we have to apply when we're deciding whether or not to apply an additional sanction, extend a deferred prosecution agreement, or let that document rest as it was originally intended. So I can't really comment about the specifics that aren't public in that process, but I think that lens, the fact that the department's perspective is focused on willful criminal violations and things that might fall short of that don't come to the department's attention, can help explain why we take the steps in that case or any other.
But that lens, does that lens suggest allowing an incompleteness in complying? Because it seems that you acknowledged many ways they complied, some ways they didn't. How does this encourage them to comply then?
So
or they've fallen short?
Yes, Senator. So their obligations under the deferred prosecution agreement, they did comply with. Whether or not they're at any given moment have satisfied all the Monitor's recommendations is a different issue, but their obligations under the deferred prosecution agreement are: don't engage in any further violations of the law, implement a remedial program that at a given point satisfies the concerns the Monitor has, even if it's not by an exact date. Those are the obligations, and that's why, because they'd satisfied those obligations to the government's satisfaction, we did not extend the DPA or take further action.
Okay, thank you.
Senator Sass.
Thank you. Thanks to you both for being here, and thanks for really good written testimony. It was helpful. Mr. Day, can you break down the $2 trillion number? What do we know by business type of crime business, by geography, et cetera?
So I don't have those figures at hand, although I'm happy to go back and see if we can further parse that figure. What I can say is that a substantial portion of it does impact the United States, literally hundreds of millions of dollars. Part of that is because of the centrality of our financial system, right? Those strengths that I talked about attract criminals who wish to launder their proceeds, even if they didn't generate them here in the United States.
So I'd love to get any follow-up information on that. Thanks. I think your numbers say $300 billion is U.S. and $2 trillion is the global number, and I think tax evasion is not in that universe. Of the $1.7 trillion, I know these are broad estimates, but setting aside the $300 billion that is in the U.S. and is going to use our financial system, of the $1.7 trillion outside the U.S., does a third of it, most of it, does it touch the U.S. financial system somehow?
So I hesitate to give precise figures, in part because I would need to go back and see if we've got any better data on that. But yes, a large amount that isn't included in the $300 million would touch the U.S. financial system, right, through U.S. dollar clearing or other services that our financial system provides essentially to the global economy. And that's why we have to be so vigilant in protecting against money laundering crimes.
And so I guess, and this is for both of you too, not just you, Mr. Day, but I guess one thing I'm trying to understand is the suspicious activity reports, we're not reading most of them, right? That's not your fault. It's that there's a huge flood of these things. Do we have anything like red zone statistics to have a kind of theory of the world and where the money laundering crime is? And then where do we get reports and how much of it ends up being aligned with the kinds of stuff we're trying to prevent? We'd like to prevent, all $2 trillion of illicit funds, but do we know that there's high yield data that you're getting versus stuff that ends up just being noise in the system?
So that's exactly what we're studying, as we undertake this effort to examine whether or not we need to change these thresholds. What I can tell you is, yes, we get a lot of data, and there are review teams that are stationed all over the country who really take a very careful look at these SARs. We also use technology, of course, to analyze the data so that while not every SAR may be reviewed, it certainly is targeted for analysis, which has been extraordinarily helpful. But happy to, as we continue our review, happy to share with you what we're learning.
Thanks. My team and I would love to not formally send you a letter on that, but just learn your after-action reports on that would be really helpful. Could you also walk us through a typical case, either as an agent or a field manager, where you used financial intelligence, such as these suspicious activity reports, and then ultimately catch criminals? What's the modal type of investigation that leads to successful prosecution?
So I'll give you an example, but I should say that there is no necessarily prototypical way because it is so useful. This type of information to prosecutors and agents can be used in a variety of ways. One way is to start a case. So in other words, as Sigal mentioned, there are teams that regularly look through setting criteria, the system, to try to determine are there new financial crimes occurring in their district that they need to initiate an investigation into. In other instances, we might have started an investigation based on a cooperating witness or some completely independent source of information, but then we go query the Bank Secrecy Act system that includes the SAR data in order to further the investigation, to learn more about what other things are these potential defendants into that we need to investigate. So it really is a very wide universe, precisely because it's so useful to law enforcement.
So I think lots of Americans would have a sense of how a drug cartel would need to use the financial system to launder their money. But in a case like human trafficking, give us an example of how a case would unfold, where you get information and where does it yield something? Why and how are they using our system?
Sure. So human trafficking, or really almost any other crime, is all motivated by financial gain. So there has to be a way for the criminals, if they're going to engage in the crime, to use the proceeds that they glean from that. And that involves bringing the proceeds into the financial system. If they're successful, laundering those proceeds so that they can use them to purchase goods, reinvest in the criminal enterprise, create additional harms to the community. So Often, the financial data is useful because it allows us to see the full human trafficking network or other criminal networks, because the money goes out to the different parts of the network or comes in from the different parts of the network that generate the illicit proceeds. It has to come in and be redistributed.
I'm at time, but I'll follow up with you both offline. I'd like to ask some specific questions about how we target specific organizations like MS-13, for example. So thanks.
Thank you. Senator Reed.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you both for your excellent testimony. At page 5 of your testimony, Mr. Day, you say that one of the money laundering threats is the purchase of real estate and other assets. And I understand, Secretary Mandicella, that there's a program in the Department of Treasury where you've identified certain areas of the country, and you are looking at these acquisitions of above a certain value, and doing so through the title insurance companies. Can you explain how that's working?
So we're using our geographic targeting order, which is an authority that was given to us by the Congress and expanded over the summer to extend to wire transactions. And essentially what we're doing is we're telling the title insurance companies that they have to report to us who the beneficial owners are involved in transactions involving high-end real estate, in all cash type of real estate. Again, high-end real estate transactions, and then of course we are analyzing that data. We've already issued an advisory, which was a result not only of the data that we analyzed when we first issued the geographic targeting orders, but we also thought that it was very important to highlight to the real estate industry some of the red alerts, some of the risks that they should be identifying when they're taking in and working on this business.
And you have the legal authority. There's no question about the legal authority for you to do this.
It's a legal authority that the Congress gave to us, yes.
One of the difficulties is finding who the ultimate beneficial owner is. So how insistent are you with these? And it seems to me that title insurance companies typically don't do that. But so how effective is this in terms of actually discovering the ultimate beneficial owner rather than the first phase of several phases of ownership?
Again, they're required by law and required by our order to report that information to us, and we've been able to gather a great deal of information as a result.
Is that information available to the Congress and the public?
That is not information that is available to the public. We're analyzing. It's
available to us.
Submitted to us pursuant to our Banking Secrecy Act authorities. We'd be happy to work with you on any requests.
What type of beneficial owners trigger a response by the Treasury? Is it someone who has a criminal activity? It's someone who's been sanctioned by the United States government, or what's the red line in terms of the beneficial owner is bad or good?
Senator, that's really going to depend on the investigation. Of course, it's not just Treasury that's looking at the information that comes in through the Banking Secrecy Act and the SAR reporting. It's also a cadre of law enforcement agents all over the country that are taking a very careful look at it. Any particular economic authority that we deploy in connection with SAR activity or other information we receive in a variety of sources about illicit activity. It's going to, again, what we decide to do will depend on the.
Have you made a referral to the Justice Department yet for enforcement action in any of these real estate transactions?
Again, that information is likewise available to law enforcement through the Bank Secrecy Act. So as with all of the BSA data that comes into the Treasury Department, law enforcement has full access to any information, and of course we work closely with them to the extent they need our assistance.
I know Mr. Day wants to respond. I have one other question. And would you want a quick response, Mr. Day, now, and then I'll go back to the Secretary?
Only to add that law enforcement is excited about the potential and is starting to see some of the fruits of this effort. Because remember, if you're talking about money laundering into real estate, you're talking about very large dollar money laundering transactions. So those are big time cases we need to bring.
Right. Switching gears slightly, your sanction activities against the North Korean regime, are you in any way able to impede the remissions that are paid by North Korean workers in Russia or other places?
Senator, to the extent that we can use our sanctions authorities to target that kind of activity, we have done so. We have had designations connected to laborers. Of course, as you know, there's UN Security Council resolutions in place that specifically address, among other sources of revenue, laborers, and we expect that those countries will abide by their UN Security Council resolution obligations. And of course, we continue to pressure them to do so.
But unilaterally, are we pursuing them aggressively in terms of identifying any type of transmission mechanism and disrupting it?
We continue to pursue North Korea's sources of revenue on a wide variety of fronts.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Senator Tillis.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you both for being here. Madam Secretary, I had a question for you. It relates to some of the questions that I had in the hearing a couple of weeks ago. You mentioned a couple of times that you think the financial institutions are engaged in a number of high-value activities, and I think that's a good thing. But when you see some of the numbers, Bank of America is headquartered in North Carolina, when you see 800 people focused on that, I've got to believe there's some low-value activities that are going on there, too. If you take a look at the fines, I think the GAO issued a report back in 2016 that said since 2009, $5.1 billion in penalties, I guess, have been paid by the financial institutions. What work have we done to look at how, with that sort of exposure out there, how much of their work could actually be dedicated to doing nothing more to make sure they're compliant and not subject to a penalty versus focusing their resources on the higher value activities that I think we all need to do? What are we looking at to try and make an objective assessment about the current status?
Thank you, Senator. So again, and we do this in very close coordination with our regulatory partners and our law enforcement efforts. I do think we need to make sure that those resources are carefully calibrated towards producing the kind of financial crimes analysis that we need that really feeds into the cases that we're able to bring to tackle the threats and the money laundering threats that we face. So we are again taking a very careful look at how we are incentivizing the banks to target their resources and efforts to the kinds of activities that provide higher value to us, and we're talking to the federal banking regulators about that. We're talking to law enforcement about it as well.
Yeah, this is only conceptual. I'm not offering this up as necessary. Thematically, it's more along the lines of offer them a bounty to identify bad actors versus subject them to a penalty for not necessarily getting the paperwork right. It's just I think, a mentality that we should look at. And with respect, Mr. Day, I had a question for you, and it relates to Secretary Mnuchin recently announcing that he's going to have a working group on digital currencies, and that kind of skates into the money laundering lanes. Given that if we're going to start looking at how to do a better job here and establish a working group, it seems that it would be helpful to have DOJ at the table, since at the end of the day, everything you put into place would be with the goal of ultimately having a successful prosecution. What's your view of that? And Madam Secretary, you can weigh in as well.
Sure. I agree, but I should say, just as my colleague Segal said, we already have a very good, robust working relationship, and so I fully expect I saw that announcement as well, but I...
So whether or not you sit on the working group, you feel like you'll have adequate input into the process, Madam Secretary?
Oh, I don't have any question. We actually do sit in working groups with the Department of Justice, very specifically focused on virtual currencies. In fact, in a previous iteration, I supervised the section of the Justice Department that was focused on cryptocurrency and virtual currency. So, yeah, we have a robust relationship. Of course, we need to work very much in concert with each other as we identify and regulate and enforce our laws to counter illicit uses of virtual currency.
I had a couple of questions that I think add on to where Senator Sass was going. If it's a $2 trillion aggregate market, $300 billion in the United States. Does that mean if we solve our whole problem, we've still got an 80% problem to deal with out there? In other words, how do we go about this? I understand that we have to deal with our backyard, but how are we going about this to where we've just simply not made it an unfavorable jurisdiction, but fundamentally the same activity is going to occur?
We do actually, we already do a great deal of work with our international partners in a wide variety of areas. So just as an example, we sit as the vice president of the Financial Action Task Force, which is an international body that's focused on making sure that countries all over the world have the same kinds of standards that we do when it comes to AML, CFT regimes. We also work very closely with law enforcement and other agencies all over the world on tackling these threats. At the Treasury Department, we likewise do that in the context of the G7 and the G20. I engage, and I have a team of people at the Treasury Department who engage with our partners, again, all over the world to make sure that we are aggressively tackling the illicit financing that's coming through the U.S. system and also that resides elsewhere.
Now, Madam Secretary, is the Treasury going to be on point to define other stakeholders and really set the priority? And I always talk about the tip of the spear because we got different people who are looking at, or different agencies who may be looking into this issue. Is Treasury at the tip? Are they going to kind of coordinate, engage the stakeholders, and be the one that the industry looks to for guidance going forward and certainty?
So we already do that. We have among the mechanisms in which we engage with the private sector. We chair the Bank Secrecy Act Advisory Group, which is an entity that brings together law enforcement, our interagency partners, as well as a wide spectrum of entities in the financial sector. So that's something that we do. It's something we'll continue to do in that venue and another fora as well.
Thank you. Sorry I went over, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Senator Tester.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank both the witnesses for being here today. Kind of going on with that, other countries that are tackling this issue, how effective have they been? Number one.
It's really going to depend on the country. It's something that we monitor very carefully. So within just as an example, the context of the FATF, the FATF conducts evaluations of other countries' AML, CFT regimes, and we play a very important role in that area. And where countries are not living up to their standards, Iran is a perfect example of that. We push very heavily to make sure that there are consequences to not having an AML, CFT regime in place that meets our standards.
All right. And of the money laundering that is done worldwide, can you give me any estimate how much of it's done in this country?
I think Mr. Day spoke to that already.
That's fine. Go ahead. Shoot quickly then.
Sure. Roughly $300 million, I believe, is the...
And what's that a percentage of the total?
So the best estimates I've seen are more than $2 trillion globally on an annual basis.
Okay. So when it comes to money laundering in this country, is most of it done through the largest institutions, or is it done through regional or community banks?
I don't think you can actually pinpoint exactly where. The safe answer is criminals will go wherever they can with their illicit proceeds. So it happens at global financial institutions, national, regional, small banks,
Gotcha.
And even non-banks like brokerage houses.
But you, and it's okay if you don't, I guess, but you don't know if most of it's going through the big guys or the small guys or the regional guys? I know, I get it. They'll go to the weakest link in the fence, but currently, where's most of it happening?
It all depends on the case. That's a very case-specific question.
Okay.
Sometimes it goes to the biggest institutions, sometimes it doesn't. It just depends on how the criminals put together their scheme.
What I hear you say, and unless I don't understand this issue properly myself, what I hear you say of that $300 million that is being laundered here, it's pretty much equal between small, medium, and large.
I wouldn't want to put a percentage on it. I really don't know, Senator.
So, and I don't want to be, but isn't that important to know? Isn't it important to know where the dough is going and how it's being laundered so that you can make the regulation fit the risk?
Sure. Well, and Treasury can speak to this even better than Justice, but the Bank Secrecy Act is a risk-based approach, and so you're exactly right. We are focused on identifying the largest risks, and we are constantly reevaluating and fine-tuning and training our investigative resources where we think is the largest threat.
Okay.
But it would be a mistake to think of it as just happening in one
No.
area.
I'm not saying that. I'm just saying as we look at this from 30,000 feet, you're going to put the resources where most of the problems are having, and if you don't know where those problems are, that's a bit disturbing for me.
Well, I don't mean to suggest we don't know where those problems are. It's just that we never rest on our laurels in the sense that where the problems are today isn't where they'll be tomorrow.
I got it. But today you can't even tell me where the laundry is.
Not as a percentage basis. No.
Okay, all right. Is there technology out there that can be, that you guys are recommending for banks of any size, but particularly the smaller ones, to be able to utilize to protect themselves?
So the Justice Department wouldn't play that role.
Who does? Anybody?
I don't know if a regulator does or not.
We don't recommend a particular vendor or type of technology for any particular kind of financial institution. We do provide guidance and training to banks.
Okay.
So
that's good. So where do they go? Where do they go to get the information so they know where the threats potentially are coming from to be able to protect themselves and the consumers ultimately?
So I think there are a variety of places that they go. Of course, there's a whole AML, CFT compliance industry out there, of course, that they can talk to. But what we're focused
and where are they getting their instruction from?
What we're focused on, Senator, is making sure that we are providing financial institutions of all types and sizes with critical information to help them identify risks and typologies. That's why, for example, in this initiative, FinCEN Exchange, which I mentioned at the beginning, we are going to, and we have in the past, frankly, talking to not just the big banks, but also local, regional community banks, so that we can help them build their system, their red alerts, their algorithms to identify critical risks. And I think that kind of information is really critical to achieving the strong and effective regime that we want.
Okay, we'll have a few more for the record. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Kennedy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you both for being here. Can we agree that you and your agencies couldn't do your job without the cooperation of our private sector financial institutions?
The cooperation that we receive from financial institutions is critical to doing what we're trying to accomplish, which is to have a strong and effective regime.
And in fact, it's mandated, is it not?
Absolutely.
Okay. How much do American financial institutions spend every year complying with the mandates?
I'm sure those figures are available. I don't have them before me. I think Clearinghouse, for example, might be able to provide you with some of those numbers. But it's a significant amount. There are a lot of resources that the banks, financial institutions, and other entities regulated by the Bank Secrecy Act are devoting to compliance.
Was it in the hundreds of millions?
Again, I don't have those numbers, but they're substantial.
You've never looked at the cost?
Again,
have either of you ever looked at the cost?
I don't have those figures either, Senator.
Okay. What's the dollar amount of money laundering that you stop every year?
I don't have those figures in front of me, but it's also significant, both in terms of actual money that's being laundered that we seize and forfeit, as well as conduct that we're able to prevent and deter from the prosecutions we bring. But I don't have a precise figure for you.
Do you know, Madam Secretary?
So I can't give you a number. What I can tell you is that we used a number of different economic authorities to stop illicit money from coming into this system. Right. That's what we use our designations for. For example, we're sending out the message that if you are going to try, not only if you're a designated entity and you have money in the United States,
I'm sorry
but your money's not welcome.
I only got 5 minutes.
Yeah.
Don't you think it would make sense at some point to say, okay, here's the cost and here's the benefit? I mean, is there anybody in your agencies that do that?
Absolutely, Senator. I think it is a very important endeavor, and as we decide what rules and regulations
Can you get me
roll
that
out
information?
in the future, we undertake that kind of those kinds of exercises.
Can you get me that information?
Again, some of that information is resident within the financial institutions in terms of what costs that
Yes,
they
ma'am, but
are using.
Can you get it for me?
I can provide to you what information we have. I don't know that I have an assessment of the total costs that are used.
General,
by the
can you get it
compliance
for
community.
me?
Senator, I don't know either that the Justice Department, remember, I guess our role is more narrow. We're ultimately focused on prosecuting
I'm going to take
money.
that as a no.
I'm happy to take back any requests.
Yeah, if you could just ask, pretty please.
Of course.
This is our second hearing, and I've learned a lot, but I still haven't heard what changes you're recommending. I understand we need to have more conversations. Tell me, in the 2 minutes I have, with specificity, what changes you are recommending that we make, General.
Beneficial ownership is a problem we need to fix.
Do you have a suggestion on how we fix beneficial ownership?
We need to gather information about.
But in terms of a bill?
We don't have any proposed legislation, no, but we are more than happy to engage with you or your staff.
Well, I'm engaging. Can you send to me with specificity the changes you need to make in beneficial, you're recommending we make in beneficial ownership?
I'd be happy to take that back. And there are some
Anything else?
increased penalties for bulk cash smuggling. So
Okay.
that's right now subject to a 5-year statutory maximum.
All right, can you send that to me with some specificity?
I'd be happy to take that back, but increased
Okay.
statutory maximum.
Anything else?
There are some additional tweaks to the money laundering statutes that we'd be happy
All right, can you send me those tweaks?
Yes, sir.
Madam Secretary, how about you? Specificity.
We'd be happy to work with your staff. What I can tell you is, but I also want to, as I mentioned already, this is something that we have to do carefully, and we have to make sure that any fixes that we proposed are supported by the analytics.
I want to be careful, and I appreciate all of that. But what I'm asking is, at some point, you've got to go from 30,000 feet to the ground. Are you ready to send to us, with specificity, suggested changes in the acts that we should make and why?
Again, Senator, we are studying that issue very carefully. I want to make sure
You're not
that,
ready? I'm not trying to be rude.
I understand.
This is the second hearing we've sat through, and I've learned a lot, and I appreciate it. But I'm ready. Understand the global perspective. I'm kind of ready to get down out of la-la land down into the nuts and bolts. How do we fix the problem, and what's it going to cost?
And again, Senator, we're getting into the nuts and bolts. I want to make sure that whatever changes we recommend, those changes are supported by the data, the analytics, and the law enforcement community to make sure that we're doing this. When
do you think you'll have that?
I can't give you a time frame, but happy to have further discussions.
Within
about
6
it.
months?
I would hope that we could have some recommendations within 6 months.
3 months?
Again, I want to make sure that we're doing this carefully. That any changes we're making are made or we're recommending are made in very close cooperation with the law enforcement community, because that.
Well, I just respectfully ask you, let's get down to it. Okay?
Appreciate that request.
You're raising problems. Let's look for solutions, and if you can't tell us how to solve them, then point us in the right direction. And if you could get me that cost-benefit analysis, I'll send you both a fruit basket. Okay? Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Senator Warner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let the record show that this is the second one of these hearings I've stayed till the end. I'm the last guy talking. Let me, first of all,
Duly noted.
commend my friend, the senator from Louisiana, for once again asking common sense, practical, bottom line questions. And I actually think this is one of those rare areas where there's, I don't think there's a difference Democrat, Republican in terms of how we approach this. So, I'd love to work with you on beneficial ownership. I think we need to look at areas where we could use technology. I think we heard the last hearing, for example, literally tens of thousands of SARS reports, but we don't really know how to sort through them. So how do we do this in a technology-friendly way that still protects consumer information? I still think we got a lot of work to do on cryptocurrencies to get ahead of this. And I think we've also heard, both in this hearing and the others, that a lot of the money laundering may have moved from kind of traditional through the banks, particularly into real estate, and there's work there. So I appreciate very much the senator's questions. I would look forward to those answers as well. But if the administration can't come up with some ideas, I think you and I and members of this committee and the leadership of the chairman could. So let me try to drill down on a couple of these. I mean, at the last hearing, I raised the issue around cryptocurrencies and what we're doing, and I know Senator Tillis raised the issue that Secretary Mnuchin has got a working group. But when we see just the notion that China said they were going to look a little bit more into this, and we saw a huge drop in value, for example, on one of these cryptocurrencies, on Bitcoin, in the last couple of weeks, do you feel like you have all the tools you need, and this is an area that's happening, moving so quickly? Do you have the tools you need and the technology analysis you need to make sure that we get ahead, not just with Bitcoin, but any kind of blockchain-related technology to do this right?
So this is an area of high focus for us, and in fact, I think it's an area where the Treasury Department, in close coordination with our law enforcement partners, have been ahead of the game globally. And I'll just walk you through some of the efforts that we have.
Fairly quickly, because I got a series of questions.
Sure.
Unless the chairman wants to give me a couple extra minutes since I waited so long.
And I'd be happy to provide more information in another setting. But just as an example, in 2014, FinCEN issued guidance identifying virtual currency exchangers and administrators as entities that are regulated under the BSA. So those entities are now required, among other things, to file SARs. They are subject to examinations by FinCEN and the IRS, which we have been conducting. We have had enforcement actions. Both the Treasury Department and the Justice Department have gone after virtual currency.
Could you get me that list? So again, because I want to get a couple more questions, but I'd love to see it and share it with the full committee. I mean, when we think, again, talking about SARs, for example, one of the things that appears is we've got this massive amount of information. It would seem to me that there may be technology tools we could use that could show patterns that might not otherwise be evident. How do we do that in also a way where we protect an issue Senator Warren and I have worked on, personal consumer financial information? How do we get that balance right between being able to see patterns but still protect consumers' information?
So just in terms of detecting patterns, we have efforts underway to make sure that we are using technology to analyze the vast amount of information that's in the BSA. In fact, I have a council of folks at the Treasury Department that I've recently stood up who are working very collaboratively together to make sure that we are appropriately using the tools that we have, and that we are identifying other areas or other tools that we can deploy to make sure that, again, we're detecting patterns, trends, and a lot of that of what we're able to obtain using those kinds of tools and analysis feed into the authorities, the economic authorities that we use, the Justice Department authorities, but we also then loop that information back out into the financial sector.
If you could again get us a little more background on that.
Happy to do so.
I've got a couple seconds left. What about one of the issues I think we wrestle with as well is, we've got to have strong anti-money laundering procedures, but how do we get that right with also making sure there are appropriate financial products for the underbanked? For example, the immigrant community who uses remittances a lot. Obviously, there's a ripe area for abuse, but there's wide swaths of our country that are underbanked that need to use these tools. How do you sort through and think through that notion?
Yeah, it's a very good question, and I think it's a complicated one. Again, I think it's important that we make sure that our financial institutions, including money services businesses, money transmitters, are appropriately regulated so that those avenues of transferring money are available and available in ways that are used licitly. So, and of course, we also do outreach to those kinds of communities to make sure that they understand both the risks and the requirements that they have in place to have the kind of AML-CFT programs that we believe are appropriate.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think there's a lot of work to be done here.
Thank you. Senator Donnelly, yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank the witnesses for being here. Mr. Day, in your testimony, you highlight virtual currencies as an alternative to cash that criminals may use for illicit transactions. Cryptocurrencies such as Bitcoin and Ripple and Ethereum provide anonymity and are lightly regulated with limited AML controls. And this would be to both of you. To what extent do you believe criminal networks, terrorist groups, rogue nations have utilized cryptocurrencies as a means for moving money? Mr. Day, if you could go first.
So we have seen criminal groups focus on digital currencies. There have been a number of prosecutions. Several years ago, the Justice Department prosecuted Liberty Reserve. And as Segal mentioned, that was a coordinated effort where Treasury deployed anti-money laundering authorities. At the same time, we announced our prosecution. The estimates at the time were about $6 billion worth of money laundering through Liberty Reserve, so a very significant money laundering problem, precisely because it offered anonymity to the criminals that were using it. More recently, the Justice Department has prosecuted a digital currency exchange service in the Northern District of California for failure to have anti-money laundering controls, and it's a problem where we're going to continue to devote significant additional resources. We just hired a digital currency council whose job is to make sure that prosecutors and agents are up to speed on the latest evolving money laundering threats in the digital currency space.
Ms. Mandelker.
So it is an area that we're tracking very, very carefully. We're concerned about the use of cryptocurrencies for illicit purposes all over the world, just as we are a number of other means that illicit actors use to transfer value. I think one area that we're working on, but that we have to really hone in on is the fact that while in the United States, we have regulations over these virtual currency exchangers and administrators. Those kinds of regulations are lacking in many different regions of the world, and so we have to encourage other countries to do what we, Japan, Australia, and some others have done to make sure that those industries are appropriately regulated.
And I guess that follows up on my next question, which was how can law enforcement and federal authorities minimize or monitor these transactions as you move forward? What's the most important thing you need to do to be able to have success in that area?
So we are monitoring the transactions. We actually, because we do have AML-CFT requirements here in the United States, we actually get a lot of SAR reporting from the virtual currency exchangers. But we also have to send the message, which we have done throughout the world, that to the extent these virtual currency exchangers are engaging in illicit activity, we're going to go after them. So just as a brief example, with the Justice Department, we recently assessed a very significant monetary penalty of $100 million against a virtual currency exchanger that was resident and principally operating in a foreign jurisdiction.
There have been a number of reports that the United States is among the easiest countries to create anonymous shell companies in. Anyone can legally open bank accounts. Anyone can buy property. As a result, criminal networks, corrupt dictators, terrorists can move money through the U.S. As a legal business entity. I would like to know from both of you what resources are available to you to identify the sources of illicit financing, and then what difficulties are presented by these weak corporate transparency rules where, in effect, almost anything goes.
So I just wanted to start by pointing out that the FinCEN did issue a rule in 2016, the customer due diligence rule, that actually now requires financial institutions to get information about the beneficial owners, the natural persons that are behind their customer accounts. I think that's a very important development. That rule is going to go into effect in May, and I know a lot of financial institutions are already gathering and collecting that information. Of course, there's also been a lot of discussion about other mechanisms that that we can put in place through legislation to gather additional beneficial ownership information, which is important in the context where it's you can't just rely on the financial institutions to gather that kind of information.
Mr. Day.
Thank you, Senator, for your question on this issue. Law enforcement does view the lack of a systematic beneficial ownership regime in the United States as something that does cause us to expend a lot of additional time and effort in individual cases, piercing the corporate veil, trying to figure out who are the bad actors that are hiding these illicit proceeds. So we're able to do it through a lot of gumshoe traditional investigative work, but we would bring more cases more quickly with more impact if we had a better system in place to make that information available to law enforcement.
Thank you to both of you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Senator Cortez Masto.
Good morning, Undersecretary Mandelker. Mr. Day, thank you for the conversation today. Very, very important discussion we're having. One of the things I want to shift just a little, though, and you'll appreciate this. Besides the financial institutions, I come from the state of Nevada, and gaming is considered like those financial institutions. Qualified casinos are subject to the Bank Secrecy Act. So I have a couple of questions around gaming in general, because I know the organizations within my state and across the country have suggested that gaming operators would welcome a review of the BSA requirements like everyone else that we're talking today about. And they look forward to this committee's thoughtful bipartisan review of the BSA requirements that takes into account the security imperative for robust anti-money laundering efforts, as well as the impact those requirements have on all industries. So one of the top priorities of the gaming industry is to eliminate the requirement that a detailed factual narrative is required when filing a suspicious activity report form for structuring situations. What are the pros and cons of such a change? And I'm going to ask both of you to answer that question.
As with any SAR reporting, we do receive a great deal of benefit from the narratives that are provided in the context by the gaming industry, by financial institutions, among other areas. I understand that there have been some discussions about whether or not the resources are well spent when it comes to the structuring SARs. Of course, that's something that we'll take into consideration and consider, and we welcome the thoughts of others in discussing.
Willing to address and listen to them and address some of the concerns too.
We're certainly happy to have the discussion with them.
Okay, Mr. Day?
I would just second what Segal said, which is the information that we glean from the narrative portion of a suspicious activity report can be very helpful in deciding to initiate a criminal investigation or furthering a pre-existing case. So there probably is opportunity to at least discuss changes, but it should be at least leavened by the notion that there's a lot of benefit to law enforcement now, and what can we do to preserve that benefit going forward.
Okay. And then the gaming industry and others have recommended, and I heard it at our last hearing, raising the currency transaction and suspicious activity reporting thresholds. Some have recommended increasing the rate roughly to about $60,000. Others say that's too high, but a lesser amount from $5,000, $10,000 to $20,000 and $25,000 would be an improvement. Your just thoughts on that? Pros and cons, or should we even be looking at that threshold amount?
Similar to the answer I gave a moment ago, there are crimes that don't involve a lot of money. And so I fear, or one potential disadvantage to raising the thresholds without substantial study like Segal is discussing, is that you risk losing visibility into those types of crimes. The classic example is the lone wolf terrorism example that doesn't involve a lot of money and might not hit upon one of those thresholds, but might a lower threshold. So it's obviously an opportunity for us all to have this discussion and make sure the thresholds are correct, or if they need to be tweaked, what should they be? But it should be balanced against this need to maintain visibility into those types of criminal activity.
Okay. And what I've heard constantly is the lack of communication. So I appreciate and applaud the launch of FinCEN Exchange. Can you talk a little bit more about that? And how will that draw in industry that is being regulated in the discussion that we're having today, and how they can talk to you directly about some of the concerns and whether those concerns can be addressed or not?
I'd be happy to. So this is actually something that we had piloted in the past, and now we're accelerating. So what we've been able to do in these settings is bring together financial institutions of all different types and sizes across the country, and among other things, have discussions with them on particular cases. So we'll provide them with information that they can then use. And
this would include non-depository institutions like gaming.
Right now,
we're
focused on the financial institutions, but we're happy to have discussions about whether or not we'd want to use it in other settings as well. What we also are very focused on doing through FinCEN Exchange and through our financial advisories, among other ways of communicating, is providing financial institutions with typologies. What are the kinds of activity that they should be alert for? How can they continue to sophisticate their algorithms based on what our priorities are, what the threats that we're seeing that are most troubling. So it's a mechanism to make sure that we're really significantly enhancing the private-public information sharing that's, I think, going to be so critical to ensuring that we're getting the kind of data from the financial institutions that we need to continue to be all the more effective in safeguarding our system.
I appreciate that. And is DOJ involved in the FinCEN Exchange?
Absolutely.
So it is everybody that's involved with FinCEN that would be part of it. Okay.
Exactly.
All the agencies.
These would be meetings with FinCEN, with law enforcement, and with the financial.
I would hope you'd open it up to non-depository institutions as well, as you well know, because they are regulated. Particularly if we really want to address anti-money laundering and go after and target, then we need to bring all of the regulated agencies in to have this conversation. One final thing. I do think that there needs to be more risk-based assessment, more targeted investigations, and everybody should be a part of that, not this check the box and I've done what I had to do and pass this form on and up the ladder to somebody else. I think we've got a lot of opportunity here, both in the compliance departments that exist in all of the agencies that are regulated, along with our law enforcement and our Treasury, to really have a targeted approach and streamline it and be effective when we're trying to address money laundering issues and stop money laundering. So thank you for the conversation today.
Thank you, Senator Warren.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So at the last hearing on this topic, I focused on a few areas where we could update our money laundering laws to make life easier both for law enforcement and for small financial institutions, including making reporting requirements more sensible and making sure we know who owns American corporations. Today, I want to focus on cracking down harder on the big banks that repeatedly violate anti-money laundering laws. So think about Citigroup. Just this month, the OCC fined the bank $70 million for ignoring a 2012 order to beef up its anti-money laundering controls. In May, Citi was fined by the Fed $97 million for letting Mexican drug cartels launder money through the bank. You know, how many money laundering operations are they assisting? And Citi isn't the only one. Other big banks break the law, they get caught, and then they shrug off fines that barely dent their massive profits. While criminals and terrorists continue to move drug money and terrorist money all around the globe. Undersecretary Mandlicher, are you confident that the biggest financial institutions in the world are doing enough to comply with anti-money laundering laws?
I think that there's a lot of effort within the financial institutions to make sure that they have...
I'm not asking if there's a lot of effort. It's a really simple question. I'm asking, do you think they're doing enough to comply with the anti-money laundering laws?
Again, I think that there are very substantial efforts underway within the financial institutions to comply with the laws. To the extent that they're not complying with the laws, of course, we're going to be focused on those, both through
so
our...
let me ask it again. Do you think they're doing enough?
Again, Senator, that's a very broad question, and it's difficult for me to make a generalization. I think we're very vigilant in monitoring and making sure that they are doing enough, and where they're not, we in the Justice Department have and will continue to bring.
Well, I'm concerned about the fact that we keep going back at them repeatedly, which kind of sounds like it's not working. You know, I'm very concerned that big banks will continue to allow money laundering because the business is profitable and the penalties for violating the law are weak. Let's take another example. HSBC, I think Senator Brown raised it. In 2012, the bank agreed to pay a fine of almost $2 billion for letting Mexican drug cartels and a Saudi bank linked with al-Qaeda to launder money for years. It also admitted to moving money for customers in Iran, Libya, Sudan, and Burma, all of which were subject to U.S. sanctions. That was the largest penalty ever under the Bank Secrecy Act, and you know what? It was about 4 weeks worth of income for HSBC. The bank's CEO swore that the bank would fix the problems, but it didn't. Last February, the court-imposed monitor told a judge that he had, quote, significant concerns about the bank's compliance program, and HSBC faces a new money laundering investigation right now in the UK. Still, the Department of Justice dismissed its case against the bank in December. So let me ask Mr. Day, do you think the fine in the HSBC case worked? Did it get HSBC to start following the law?
I think there are a number of parts about that prosecution that cumulatively had their desired impact.
So
when you think
let me just stop. It had the desired impact. Then how can it be that a court-installed monitor refused to certify that HSBC's anti-money laundering compliance program was working? And in November, the UK just opened a new investigation, evidently based on new evidence of money laundering. I don't understand how you can say that worked.
So that was a Justice Department installed monitor, and that's another way of, I guess, thinking about the deferred prosecution agreement, is that it included a range of measures, including, for example, the decision by the Justice Department to impose a monitor to give us confidence that the various provisions of the agreement were being satisfied by HSBC.
I'm glad for you to have confidence, but I only want you to have confidence if it's actually working. And the monitor said it's not. So I'm not clear how you can say that this is working. You know, let me just make the point, because I'm running out of time here, and I have one more quick question I want to ask. It's never going to work so long as the consequences are lame fines and no accountability for individuals at the bank who are responsible for the illegal conduct. I promise you that if HSBC executives had been hauled out in handcuffs and were sitting in jail after their violations in 2012, they would have gotten the procedures in place pretty darn fast to make sure that that bank was in compliance with the law. So I'm over, but let me just ask a quick one. Mr. Day, doesn't the Bank Secrecy Act empower the Justice Department to go after individuals responsible for breaking the law?
Of course, Senator, and we are focused on bringing individual cases where the facts and the evidence merit such cases, and we have done so in the past, and we'll continue to do so.
If we want to stop money laundering, these giant banks really need to feel the penalties, and the people who are in charge, who are making the decisions, need to understand that if they are putting the American people at risk, that they will go to jail. Until that happens, we're not going to fix anything here. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. And our final set of questions from Senator Van Hollen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank both of you for your testimony today. And I do just want to add to what both the chairman and the ranking member said, and you've said in your testimony earlier about the importance of getting to this beneficial ownership issue. I believe that's going to be a major focus of the committee's efforts. Secretary Mandelker, when you were here for your nomination hearing, I asked you about the FinCEN's geographic targeting order, and I think Senator Reid asked some questions regarding that. You did extend it to March 20th, I believe, of this year. Is there any? Have you found that a useful tool? And I see that you did expand some of the geographic areas.
Yes, we have found that it is a very valuable tool. It allows us the opportunity to get critical information to support our efforts and to support law enforcement's efforts.
And you have an expectation you will continue this beyond March 20th of this year?
So I can't, as with any kind of tool, I can't tell you what our forward plans are. We have extended that tool a number of times in the past.
Okay. Well, based on the past track record, I would hope that you would do that. I know Senator Warner asked some questions about cryptocurrency, and I did want to follow up on some of those. Did you see the Reuters report, January 8th, headline, "Cryptocurrency may be getting quietly channeled to North Korea University"? I don't know if did that hit your radar screen.
I didn't see that particular report, but I have seen similar reports linking cryptocurrency to the North Korean regime.
Right. So I just want to follow up on that because I know we're all working hard on effective sanctions regimes and enforcement. A chief analyst at one of the South Korean cybersecurity firms, EST, was quoted in this article as saying that with economic sanctions in place, cryptocurrencies are currently the best way to earn foreign currency in North Korea's situation. It is hard to trace and can be laundered several times. They specifically mention the 13th largest cryptocurrency trader in the world, I guess, Monero. Has that been on your radar screen, and what steps are you taking to make sure that North Korea can't evade different sanctions regimes through use of cryptocurrency?
So we are, as you know, we're focused on illicit financing to North Korea in a wide spectrum of areas. Of course, cryptocurrency is one of them, but the North Korean regime has been able to finance itself through a number of different mechanisms, including through the financial system. So I'd put to put cryptocurrency to the side, we have to remain vigilant in making sure that North Korea is not using the international financial system as they have repeatedly in the past to finance their weapons program. So cryptocurrency, of course, will be an effort, a focus for us, but as is the many different ways in which the North Korean regime has been able to build up to the place where we find ourselves today.
No, absolutely. I mean, I think we've got to make sure we cover all of those sources of financing. It appears that to the extent that we're more successful at shutting down conduits through the normal financial system, they may turn to these cryptocurrencies, increasingly do that. So with respect to these exchanges for cryptocurrencies, do you think that they should be held to the same standards as we do banks?
So here in the United States, they are subject to AML, the same AML requirements that they're characterized under our laws as a money transmitter, and so they are required to have AML, CFT regime. We do examine them just as we examine other financial institutions. We have brought enforcement actions, not just here in the United States, but also against a virtual currency exchanger overseas. We assessed a $100 million penalty over the summer, and the Justice Department has brought even stronger penalties against those kinds of exchangers. I think the real vulnerability that we all have to address is that while we have regulatory authorities in place here in the United States, and we do enforce those authorities, we need other countries to do the same. So countries like Japan and Australia are very much in line with us in regulating virtual currency exchangers, but we have a focused effort on encouraging many different countries to make sure they have the regime in place to keep this type of currency from being manipulated and used by illicit actors.
Got it. And that brings me to my last question, which I know Senator Tillerson raised earlier and other members of the committee, which is we're doing our best to defend our own financial system and encourage others through international efforts that you testified about earlier. What, at the end of the day, are we looking at tools to make sure that we strengthen penalties and the costs for those overseas that are not complying with our efforts? Because we can do everything we can here, but if you've got, as others have said, 75% of these money laundering efforts going on overseas, we're just plugging one hole out of a whole lot of them. So what is the plan going forward to make sure we use our leverage in the financial system to make sure that other people are complying?
Absolutely. So as I just mentioned, for example, in the virtual currency space, we brought an enforcement action against a virtual currency exchanger that was resident overseas. A lot of the work that we do is focused on these kinds of cross-border illicit transactions. And I know many of the cases, just as an example, the Justice Department brings, I know from my days at the Justice Department and just looking at the work that they're doing now, there's a very, very big focus on bringing criminal penalties against illicit actors, no matter where in the world that they operate. We do that. We do that through FinCEN, OFAC, and the Justice Department does it as well.
And you have all the authorities you think you need to do that effectively now?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. For those senators who want to ask questions for the record following the hearing, they will be due by January 24th. And our witnesses, I asked, as you get follow-up questions, to respond promptly.
Mr. Chairman, if I may.
Well, that was close. We'll give you your 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, it's close. Thank you very much. Time, so, but this is important, especially someone who's been one of the architects of our sanctions. So I'd like to hear some of the answers to some of these questions. So thank you both for your appearance. As someone who has been the architect of sanctions laws impacting Iran and Russia and North Korea, I understand how important it is to prevent criminals and sanctioned individuals from anonymously accessing the financial system. Therefore, it's critical that we improve beneficial ownership information to understand exactly who benefits from a legal entity. I think there's been some discussion about that from what I gathered before, and ensure that information is quickly available to law enforcement. In May, Treasury's new customer due diligence requirements for financial institutions are going to go into effect. There's been some testimony here about the nature of that in terms of banks having to identify and verify beneficial owners owning 25% or more of a legal entity, as well as an individual on the management team. Some witnesses expressed concern about Treasury's implementation of these regulations. Some suggested that there's not an actual 25% or more stake, there'd be no one to list as a beneficial owner. Ms. Mandelkar, can you address these concerns and provide some additional detail on how Treasury plans to implement this new regulation?
Well, again, as you mentioned, Senator, the rule is going to go into effect in May. I know a lot of financial institutions are already have been taking steps underway to make sure that they're complying with the rule. In addition to the 25% beneficial ownership mandate, companies are also going to have to identify who a controlling person that's resident within a particular entity. So it's not just the ownership trigger; it's also the controlling person that needs to be.
So whether or not
identified.
they're sufficient to establish a 25%, the controlling person will have to be identified.
A control person will have to be identified as well.
Do you think that that will give you the breadth and scope necessary to make sure that we know who is the beneficial entity?
I think it's a very important step. Of course, that's information that's going to go to the banks. So that it's a requirement that the banks identify and verify who the beneficial owners are and who a controlling person is, and of course, to the extent, and then we'll have the ability to obtain information as necessary and in the right circumstances from the banks.
All right, let me follow up on both Senator Warner's and Donnelly's questions on cryptocurrencies. I'm interested in your view on the use of virtual currencies by foreign sovereign states like Russia and Venezuela to evade sanctions. In recent months, both Venezuela and Russia have expressed interest in state-backed virtual currencies. In December, Venezuelan President Maduro announced he is launching a virtual currency backed by the nation's oil reserves for the explicit purpose, as is stated, of circumventing sanctions imposed by the United States. Now, perhaps lack of technological sophistication will delay or hamper this plan, but we know full well that Maduro will use every tool at his disposal to perpetuate his authoritarian objectives. So it's critical that we understand the risk here. Do you believe that the Treasury Department is monitoring these developments, and do you have the technical tools and enforcement mechanisms to combat the use of cryptocurrencies to evade U.S. sanctions?
So we are monitoring the developments. As I'm sure you're aware, we've had a very active portfolio in the context of what Venezuela is doing, in addition to a very strong executive order that the president issued in August. We've also been designating individuals who have enabled the Maduro regime to and committed what we think are a variety of different types of offenses. When it comes to the resources and tools to make sure that we're monitoring virtual currency and cryptocurrency, we do have a dedicated team of individuals at Treasury who have the expertise to monitor these activities very carefully and closely. We are regulating this industry, which is very important. We are examining virtual currency exchanges along with the IRS.
My question is, okay, so now I appreciate and I'm glad to hear that you're monitoring it, but do you believe you have the tools and mechanisms necessary in place to combat the use of cryptocurrencies to evade U.S. sanctions?
We do have tools and authorities in place to make sure that we are staying very much on top of this burgeoning industry.
Nothing that you need.
At this time, no, Senator.
Okay.
There's
Good.
not.
I'm glad to hear that. Finally, I'm aware, I'm sure you're aware that FinCEN issued guidance in 2014 to clarify Bank Secrecy Act expectations and set the rules of the road for banks and financial institutions seeking to provide services to legitimate marijuana-related businesses in states that have legalized. What I have heard, including from New Jersey institutions for which medical marijuana is legalized, and now the state is considering the possibility of legalizing the essence of recreational marijuana, is that there is a concern that according to the Pew Charitable Trust, since the guidance was issued, the number of banks and credit unions serving businesses in the industry have more than tripled to nearly 400. Regardless of my views on this, if it's going to be legal in any state, I think it should be bankable and transactionable, and we should be able to have eyes on it and understand revenues and how the money is flowing. FinCEN's guidance has been critical to alleviating some of the public safety risks as well in terms of accumulation of large quantities of cash at dispensaries and businesses. And I worry that any steps to walk back this guidance only serve to undermine public safety. So can you commit that this guidance is going to stay in place?
We are reviewing the guidance in light of the Attorney General's recent decision to revoke a Justice Department memorandum on this issue. What the guidance did was it provided guidance to financial institutions with respect to what kinds of SARs they should file in different circumstances. The laws with respect to the Controlled Substances Act, of course, remain on the books. Those haven't undertaken any changes. That would have to be done by the Congress.
Well, but when you're saying you're reviewing, does that mean that you find a conflict with FinCEN having the standards for banking transactions in states where the law permits these sales to take place or uses to take place, and that you see there is a conflict with it that would lead you to say, no, you can't bank them anymore?
I'm not suggesting that there's a conflict or not a conflict. The guidance remains in place, and we're taking a look at it in light of the Justice Department's announcement.
Would you let us know if you move to change it?
Yes, of course we would let you know.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your courtesy.
Thank you. And that is the last questioning. I've already given instructions on follow-up questions from senators and, again, urge the witnesses to respond. I'm sure we'll be engaging with you as we move forward on this issue. Thank you for testifying today, and that concludes our hearing.